In April 2025, in the depths of the Gulf of Peter the Great, in the Sea of Japan, the Russian Navy found something that had been missing for more than 80 years. A Soviet submarine from the Second World War, with its 22 crew members still aboard, resting on the ocean floor exactly in the state it was left the day it was destroyed in 1941. There was no rescue, there were no survivors. There was no one to tell what happened. For more than 8 decades, the sea kept that secret with absolute fidelity. And when Russian researchers finally managed to find it, what they saw in the underwater images left them speechless. The experts who have studied the finding do not hesitate to describe it as the discovery of the century, and when the details of what they found are known, it is impossible not to understand why. Leave your like, subscribe and share. Let us begin. To understand the magnitude of this finding, one must go back to the summer of 1941, one of the darkest and most turbulent periods in the history of the 20th century. In June of that year, Nazi Germany had launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in military history, sending millions of soldiers into Soviet territory in an attack that caught the Soviet Union relatively off guard, and that in its first weeks produced catastrophic losses for the Red Army. The Great Patriotic War, as the Soviets called their participation in the Second World War, had begun in the worst possible way, and all the military forces of the country, including the Pacific Fleet, were on maximum alert and mobilization. In this context of chaos, urgency, and sacrifice, submarine M49 went out to fulfill its mission in the waters of the Gulf of Peter the Great in the far east of the Soviet Union and never returned. The M49 belonged to the Malyutka class, whose name in Russian means precisely that, small, and the description was perfectly accurate. Malyutka-class submarines were vessels of modest dimensions compared to other submarines of the era, designed to operate in coastal waters and in closed or semi-closed seas like the Baltic, the Black Sea, and the Sea of Japan. Their reduced size was both their greatest advantage and their greatest vulnerability. It allowed them to maneuver in areas where larger submarines could not enter, but also made them more susceptible to damage caused by nearby explosions, with less capacity to absorb the impact of a mine or depth charge without fatal consequences. They were armed with a 45mm cannon and torpedoes, and their crew was small. In the case of the M49, composed of 22 men who were not only sailors but also, in the context of 1941, defenders of their country in the most desperate moment of its history. In August 1941, the M49 disappeared. The exact circumstances of its sinking were never established with certainty because there were no survivors who could recount them, and because the chaos of the first months of the war made it extremely difficult to investigate each loss exhaustively. What was known was that the Gulf of Peter the Great, where the submarine operated, was an area of high military activity with naval minefields, both Soviet and potentially enemy, and that conditions in those waters were dangerous even for vessels much larger and more robust than a Malyutka. The disappearance of the M49 was recorded, its 22 crew members were declared missing in combat, and over time the submarine became one of the many unresolved mysteries of a conflict that produced losses so massive that many could never be adequately investigated. For decades, the search for the M49 was intermittent and without results. The technology available during the Cold War was insufficient to systematically track the seabeds of the Gulf of Peter the Great, an area of deep waters and complex oceanographic conditions that make underwater exploration difficult even with modern means. But the determination of the Russian Navy to find its lost sailors never completely disappeared, and when technology finally reached the necessary level, searches resumed with renewed intensity. It was thus that in April 2025, after an intense search campaign organized by the Russian Pacific Fleet, using the rescue vessel Igor Belousov equipped with the most advanced underwater technology available, operators finally found what they had been searching for so long. Leave your like, subscribe, and share. The images and data collected by the Igor Belousov's underwater systems revealed a scenario that researchers described as overwhelmingly intact. The M49 lay at the bottom of the Gulf of Peter the Great, sunk in sea mud with severe structural damage that in itself told the story of its last moment. The damage was not that produced by the passage of time or the gradual deterioration of materials underwater. It was violent damage, explosion damage, damage that went from bow to stern and spoke of a devastating detonation that in seconds converted an operational vessel with 22 men aboard into the remains that today rest at the bottom of the sea. The evidence points unequivocally to a naval mine as the cause of sinking. one of those mines that the Soviets themselves and their allies had sown in the waters of the Gulf as defense against possible attacks, and which, in the confusion of the first months of the war, could become a deadly trap for the very vessels they were supposed to protect. The identification of the submarine was not immediate, but researchers were able to confirm it with certainty thanks to several elements. The size and shape of the sunken hull corresponded exactly to the dimensions of a Malyutka-class submarine. The visible armament, particularly the 45mm cannon that remained in its original position despite the damage suffered by the rest of the hull, was characteristic of this class of vessel. And the historical records of the Soviet Pacific Fleet confirmed that the M49 was the only Malyutka missing in that specific area of the Gulf of Peter the Great. The conclusion was unanimous. They had found the M49, and with it the remains of its 22 crew members. What makes this finding truly exceptional, beyond the fact of the discovery itself, is the state of preservation of the site. The experts who have analyzed the images and data collected by the Igor Belousov emphasize that the M49 is essentially a Second World War time capsule, a combat scenario that has remained unchanged since the moment the submarine was destroyed in August 1941. At the bottom of the Gulf of Peter the Great, separated from the world by dozens of meters of cold and dark water, time stopped for the M49 and its crew at the instant of the explosion. Everything that was inside the submarine at that moment, the navigation instruments, the tools, the personal equipment of the sailors, the onboard documents, the provisions, and the remains of the men who crewed it, is still there, in the state it was left that day in August 1941. This circumstance makes the M49 something more than a simple historical wreck. It makes it a site of memory, an underwater monument to 22 men who went out to defend their country and never returned, and whose families, if any survived, waited for years without knowing what had happened. Soviet policy of the era did not always include informing families in detail about the circumstances of the death of their soldiers and sailors, especially in the first and chaotic months of the war, when losses were so massive that the military bureaucratic apparatus simply could not keep pace with the casualties. Many families of the M49 crew probably never received a clear explanation of what had happened. Now, more than 80 years later, the finding of the submarine offers at least the possibility that this story can be told completely. The mention of submarine M63 adds another intriguing dimension to this finding. According to experts who have analyzed the search area, there is a possibility that the M63, another Malyutka-class submarine also missing and sought in the same area of the Gulf of Peter the Great, is located near the M49. If this were true, the Gulf would hold the remains of two lost submarines of the Soviet Pacific Fleet, two separate tragedies that occurred in the same sea during the same devastating first years of the Great Patriotic War. The possibility of finding the M63 is now more real than ever, because the technology and experience accumulated during the search that led to the finding of the M49 can be directly applied to locating its lost companion. The rescue vessel Igor Belousov, the vessel that made this finding possible, is in itself a testament to the level that Russian underwater technology has reached. Equipped with state-of-the-art unmanned underwater vehicles, high-resolution sonar systems, and cameras capable of producing detailed images in the darkness and pressure conditions of the seabed, the Igor Belousov represents the vanguard of the Russian Navy's exploration and underwater rescue capabilities. Its participation in this search was not coincidental. It was specifically assigned to this mission because it was the most capable vessel to carry it out, which speaks to the level of priority that the Pacific Fleet assigned to the search for the M49 and the institutional commitment of the Russian Navy to the recovery of its lost sailors. Specialists in naval history and underwater archaeology who have commented on this finding since its announcement in April 2025 have been unanimous in their assessment. Calling it the finding of the century is not a marketing exaggeration, but a well-founded technical evaluation. Second World War wrecks that remain in the state they were in at the moment of their sinking, without having been disturbed by explorers, treasure hunters, or ocean currents, are extraordinarily rare. Most known war wrecks have been visited, explored, partially looted, or altered in various ways since their discovery. The M49, on the other hand, arrived in 2025 exactly as it was left in August 1941, making it a source of historical information of incalculable value for researchers studying Soviet naval technology of the Second World War, the living and working conditions aboard submarines of the era, and the specific circumstances of naval combat in the Sea of Japan during the first years of the conflict. There is something deeply moving about the idea that those 22 men, young for the most part, who went out to sail in a small submarine in the waters of the Gulf of Peter the Great in the summer of 1941, have remained together for more than 80 years at the bottom of the sea. The ocean that swallowed them also protected them, preserving the place where they fell with an integrity that no land cemetery could have maintained for so long. Now that they have been found, the question that arises is what to do with this finding. The Russian Navy has made it clear that the M49 will be treated as an underwater grave, with the respect and solemnity that the remains of the sailors lying inside deserve. There will be no recovery of the hull nor disturbance of the site beyond what is necessary to document it adequately. The men of the M49 will rest where they fell, but no longer in anonymity. Now the world knows where they are and knows how they died, and that is the most dignified way to honor their memory after such a long silence. Leave your like, subscribe, and share. Until next time.